Salam Sejahtera. Today, I would like to share with you some of the research findings pertaining to LGBT perception among people in Malaysia. And this is part of the larger research project led by Professor Madya Dr. Ting Suhi from Universiti Malaysia Sarawak, and the rest of the names that you can see here, they are the researchers for this research project. And my name is Sharifah Sophia, and I'm going to share with you the findings, just a subset from the findings, from the overall findings, just a subset of it, and that uh, talks about the social knowledge on LGBT in Malaysia. So that's the topic of my presentation today. This is the outline. I'm going to just share with you what are the LGBT situation in our country now, the research, the key terms that we used, data collection, findings, and the conclusion. Okay, so this is the LGBT situation in our country today, in Malaysia today, and Human Rights Watch, that's the international NGO, had expressed concern about the way that the LGBT persons have been treated um, in the country, uh, and they argue that there has been an increase in the targeted persecution of people in the community, such as arbitrary arrest, assault, and extortion. So clearly, in Malaysia, there is a punishment of up to 20 years in the penal code for same-sex relation. Um, Another related development is pertaining to the move or the proposal towards what they see as strengthening the punishment, the Sharia punishment um, against the LGBT persons. And they argued that the current sentence, which is 5,000 ringgit and 6 strokes, are too lenient or maybe have a very small deterrent effect. And therefore, the argument goes that therefore it should be raised. So that's the argument out there in the public. Yeah? Made by the authorities. Um, you can go to the source here to find out more information there. So this is the objective of our research. Um, we wanted to know how does social interaction acted as a source of knowledge on LGBT, and also we like to describe what are the consequences of social interaction towards the regulation of sexuality in Malaysian context, in Malaysian situation. So there are two key terms that we used in our description as well as in our analysis. The first is the term called sexual norms. So sexual practices like LGBT are examples of acts considered deviant from the norm in Malaysia. That's I'm talking about Malaysian situation here. The normal sexual practice in Malaysian society accepts a binary gender identity, female, male, feminine, masculine, recognized by social institutions, regardless of how one feels or think about it. So regardless what individual perspective is, the structural and the institutional forces in the country really view sexual norms as 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 male and female and uh, feminine and masculine. So it's a binary uh, framework. The term LGBT is a term adopted in the late 1980s to denote non-heterosexual practices such as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. It is also the term has a mobilizing force in the fight for legal recognition. So this is a term that used by the persons to describe oneself, I imagine, in the Western context, in European context, um, And the reason why this term was chosen is for a mobilization purpose, mobilization for a legal recognition. However, there is a contradiction here, contradiction pertaining to these norms. Um, Norms seek to serve, every social scientist will recognize that norms, at least according to Emil Durkheim, seeks to create some stability in society. The concept here, the functionalist view that the social structure, the social institution is there in order to ensure stability by enforcing norms. So these norms, they are not just simply rules, but they are the basis of morality in that particular society. So norms, morality, these are the what believed to be the guideline in order to conduct person-to-person interaction, as well as to preserve some semblance of stability in that society. However, when it comes to LGBT persons, the norms pertaining to LGBT person, which in our context, in Malaysian context, they are considered as deviant, as not only different but also deviant. Therefore, the laws that we saw earlier, for example, the what was viewed by Human Rights Watch as targeted persecution, and the call by the authority to increase the punishment for non-heterosexual relations. These are have an impact on the LGBT persons. They have an impact in terms of their security, because it may or maybe indeed it has increased the stigma and harassment towards them, towards the LGBT persons. Um, and these are the consequences that are not only felt, not only perceived, but experienced by the sexual minorities here. So, therefore, why norm does this? I suppose that's the question. That's the contradiction. How does norm enforce uh, stability? I mean, enforce morality on the one hand. On the other hand, as a consequence of that enforcement, it created pain and suffering and maybe harassment to the life of um, the LGBT persons. So these are the contradiction. One of the contradictions. Another form of contradiction is that uh, the sanction, the use of sanction, uh, applied on those who profess different, um, or rather a deviant sexual identity than what is prescribed in the society's norm. So these norms and sexual, the regulation of sexuality, therefore, uh, is not an individual choice, is not within individual control, but really they are brought to bear upon the lives um, of the sexual um, minorities, such as the LGBT persons. So these are the some of the contradiction here. So the issue of gender and sexuality isn't really, in Malaysian context at least, isn't really a personal issue, isn't really about a personal choice, but really it, it is about what society views as acceptable, and what society accepts, and what society sanctions. So those who disagree with the sanction and therefore adopt a different identity, they are facing the sanction, they are facing the punishment, either from the institution or from within the social environment. So there is a contradiction here, isn't it? Contradiction in terms of the enforcement of norms, and the contradiction in terms of the space between public and private when it comes to gender and sexuality. Clearly, it's not the role of individual per se. In fact, individual has really less say in this, uh, but being the subject of the society regulation. So our study, we apply this perspective. We apply, but we are influenced by the thinking of Berger and Luckman, the notion of the social construction of everyday life, right? How knowledge is being constructed in everyday life, and they argued that there are signs that circulated in a society which serves as the index of subjective meanings, the signs. What are those signs? We will explain this shortly. And the participants of our study, we talked to 12 people. I mean, for this particular research, this particular topic on social interaction and social knowledge, we talked to 12 people, and they were Muslims and Christians and Buddhists. And their range of age 18, and some even in their 50s. So we have in the 18, 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. Okay? So those are the profile of our participants. And the participants, we we asked them about what they thought about LGBT. Have they ever met LGBT persons? Where have they heard about that? And what did they view? What were their opinion about the persons? And this is what we found. There are two themes. I think I arranged this in terms of themes about the consensus and the use of typification. Where these the framework that we applied or that we read from Berger and Luckman, and when it comes to consensus on sexual norms, and we discover that our participants are generally accept the heterosexual norms in our society here. They generally accept. They have certain disagreement about how these norms are being enforced, but nevertheless, they are generally acceptable to it. That means that the signs of gender typification, the signs of heterosexual identity, which are prevalent in our life, the signs such as what male and female should do, the gender roles, the gender representations, how women should behave and how male should behave, the so-called responsibilities assigned for male and female. These are all signs, and these are all signs that promoted the idea of of um, of heterosexual norms. And although our participants have different views specifically about how these norms works in reality, but nevertheless they recognize that that's how men and women should behave. They recognize that's what men and women should look like. So this recognition are all a result, an outcome of the abundance of the presence of science in our society. So this is some of the signs pertaining to the LGBT persons. The signs pertaining to LGBT persons tend to focus on the LGBT character rather than LGBT internal attitude. They focus on the external character. For example, about them being awkward, make one feel awkward. Therefore, being around them looks out of touch, or rather um, out of tune with how society should behave. I think participant 9, very dirty. Well, okay. and not really close, and others and others. So this is therefore tells us there is a consensus, a general consensus about sexual norms in our society, the heterosexual norms. I mean, the heterosexual norms. So this moral panic about the fear that the LGBT persons could threaten the gender stability, the identity of gender, and the stability of gender and the role of gender is actually misplaced. Uh, there is no such a threat. Instead, it's the majority who threatened the minority sense of identity of who they are as an LGBT person. But for the LGBT person themselves, they do not threaten, their presence do not really threaten the sexual norms itself. It's the other way around. It's the majority sexual norms, the heterosexual norms that imposed upon the LGBTs. Another major findings that we found in our research is pertaining to the use of typification. And the most important typification, the most important, or rather the most consistent typification that we discover is on the subject of biology. This is interesting for us because until now, until then, we thought that biological explanation is quite out of date. In fact, if you are a social scientist, then we learned that, well, biological explanation, should this, should we be talking about the social makeup of it, of the role of socialization, and not the biological predetermined essence and essentialism of an identity? So in terms of the social science discourse and the way that people understand biological really stands apart, I suppose. The ordinary people still relate to gender, still relate to identity, to the essence, to this concept of they are born with. I think the similar extension can be attributed to aspects such as race. In social science, we tend to talk about race as a construction, but people, ordinary people, everyday people, still see, well, race as in gender, as something that one is born with, as something that is essential to one's identity. So that's a finding that we makes us realize that in our society, the use of biological explanation is used to not only to legitimize heterosexual identity, but also to legitimize sanction against the sexual minorities, the LGBT persons. So they are used in both ways, to legitimize as well as to discriminate people who are different. So that's the findings of our research. So let us look at finally the conclusion. Okay, this pertaining to sexual norms and regulation. This is what we work the objective of our discussion today. So this understanding of sexuality is in context of everyday interaction. So we learn that when people, I learn from looking at the data of how people relates to LGBT. Clearly, they saw that they met LGBT people, LGBT persons. Some of them are close to them. Some of them, most of them don't. But they think that they know something about them, even though they are not really close to them. And to supplement their lack of knowledge into LGBT, because people are generally curious about this community, and because very less is known about them, and because less is spoken about them in Malaysian context, so people tend to go to social media or go to YouTube or go to sources that do not come from our Malaysian context. And nevertheless, those sources, even though these sources talks about these so-called Western sources, the imported sources, talk about LGBT and maybe have some confession and some what do you call narrative from the LGBT people themselves. Nevertheless, these narratives, these sources that came from the non-Malaysian context were perceived by our participants to be the sources that are contrary to our values. So our participants are quite sensitive about the origin of the sources. So contrary to, to the moral panic that social media may corrupt the mind of people, in our research, we discover that at least when it comes to LGBT topic, it does not corrupt them. It does not change their mind. What I mean, it does not change our participants' mind. It does not make people, suddenly embrace a different value. Instead, it strengthens their predisposition. Instead, they strengthen their initial assumption. Instead, they strengthen the common sense thinking pertaining to heterosexual identity. So there is no, not that there is no threat here, but there is a very less threat coming from these social media sources when it comes to gender identity, really. And one of the reasons why this happened is because of the way that they reacted to social, to sexual norms, to sexual identity, and LGBT people are really through their multiple interaction with multiple sources in Malaysian context. These multiple sources, such as their friends, their family, the institution, the structure, the media, all of them tend to reinforce the heterosexual norms rather than questioning it. Therefore, people, our participants at least, from what we have seen from the data, they tend to support the heterosexual norms. So again, the moral panic pertaining to the corrupting influence of social media really is misplaced, I think. The second point that we like to conclude here is the knowledge about the actual interaction with LGBT persons are very, very limited in our context. By what I mean by limited is that most of our participants, they confess that they don't really know them. They have met them, but from afar, either they're the work colleague or either they saw them in university, but they were not really familiar, or they're not really interacted in a close relations with the LGBT persons. And one of the reasons why this happened is because LGBT persons tend to not disclose their identity. They tend to keep their identity in secret. So that's the reason why we don't really see them around in our community, in our society. In cases where they're disclosing their identity, then they'll be facing with stigma and harassment and, discrimination, I imagined. Harassment is even worse, I think, the social media harassment, I think. And that again tells us that the real threat here is not the sexual minorities who are actually under threat. They are being threatened, but it's actually the majority who enforce their so-called these moral majority in order to for certain kind of compliance, a certain kind of acceptance to the dominant norms, to the dominant norms in our sexual norms in our society. So that's the conclusion of our study. So thank you very much for listening. If you're interested to know a bit more, you can send an email to myself, or you can communicate to the with the our research leader, Professor Madhya Dr. Ting Suhi from the Faculty of Language, and she'll be able to assist in your inquiry should you are interested to learn more. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you I hope we learn something new today. I hope so. Thank you very much, and all the best.